For the presentation of the Thomas Jefferson Freedom Award, here is our Executive Director, Sam Bernelli.
Thank you, Harold. It is with great pleasure and an honor that I have the opportunity to present this award tonight. The Thomas Jefferson Freedom Award is the most prestigious honor bestowed by the American Legislative Exchange Council. It is awarded annually to a nationally recognized public figure and embodies the Jeffersonian principles of free enterprise, limited government, individual liberty, and those basic American values. William J. Bennett accomplishments are many and varied. He has served as chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, the best U.S. Secretary of Education the United States has ever seen. And I might add, may ever see. And director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy. And that's when we really had a war on drugs. He is currently co-director of Empower America, a senior editor of National Review, and a dynamic favorite speaker at ALEC meetings. The Book of Virtues, his most recent achievement, is a bestseller that is widely praised by liberals and conservatives alike. And if you don't have one, get one. But Bill Bennett is best known for his courageous exposure of the failures of American education. This singular crusade best exemplifies the spirit of Jefferson. Jefferson warned us about the perils of government without limits. And by the time Bill Bennett came onto the scene, the American education system had become just another self-serving bureaucracy, far from the control of the people it had intended to serve, and farther yet from the objectives it was intended to serve, and farther yet from the objectives that it is intended to serve and what the American people needed it to do. Education had become the captive of special interests, the unions, the administrators, an educational establishment altogether too willing to plunder the future of our children, the future of America. Indeed, the future of this great nation and probably the future of the world, to add its own gain. Thursday's morning, Chairman Brubaker reminded us that the public purposes are the only legitimate providence of government. It is sad to say that America's education system has been skewed towards serving private, not public purposes. Well, Bill saw this. He sorted through the statistics and sifted through the academic jargon to set the facts before the people, and all I could hear from the bureaucracy was, it's too simple. He simplified it. You made it too simple. And in city after city, his no-nonsense, honest, and unflinching account of the dismal state of public education forever changed the terms of the education debate. In Bill Bennett, the special interests met their match. Indeed, pound for pound, and Bill's not an unsubstantial guy, as you can see, he's a pretty large guy. Pound for pound, they met their match, and they met their intellectual superior. To this day, the education establishment is terrified of Bill Bennett. Terrified is his ability to quantify the reality of American education. Terrified that virtually all Americans can relate to what he says. There was none so happy as education's ruling class when Bill Bennett left his position as Secretary of Education. But even then, there has to be no rest for the education establishment. Bill Bennett let the genie out of the bottle. Because of Bill Bennett, how we look at education was revolutionized, never ever to be the same. His prescriptions for transforming education, limiting the power of government, and incorporating free market incentives, embody individual liberty, and they remain at the true cutting edge of the education debate today. The stakes are high. As Thomas Jefferson warned us, that a nation could not be both ignorant and free. Education was the sure foundation for the preservation of freedom and happiness. Bill Bennett has made a convincing case for education. Indeed, for a society firmly rooted in those timeless and traditional American values. The timeless value of honesty, the timeless value of fairness, the timeless value of self-discipline, the timeless value of fidelity to task, friends, and family, and the timeless value of personal responsibility. Yes, the timeless values of liberty, equality, and the freedom to practice one's faith. These values are not optional. They are the very bedrock of a free democratic nation. Over a prolonged period of time, Bill Bennett cautions us, and I quote, "A crisis in American education will lead finally to a crisis in American democracy." Isn't that the truth? According to Bill Bennett, our students should know our nation's ideals and aspirations. They should know that we believe in liberty and equality, in limited government, and the betterment of the human conditions. These truths underlie our society. And though they may be self-evident, they are not spontaneously apprehended by the young. Bill Bennett's honesty, his courage, and man does he have courage, and his perseverance in facing the powerful establishment then and now illustrates the strength and the timeliness of simple virtues and remains an inspiration to all of us. Ladies and gentlemen, the battle for quality education will be won. They will not be easy battles. An entrenched, and let's state it like it is, corrupt educational establishment stands in the way. You may recall that Bill Bennett's boss, the great communicator, Ronald Reagan, brought the wrath of the establishment down on his head by calling the evil empire evil. A decade later, it had collapsed on itself. Similarly, Bill Bennett said what was necessary about the education establishment. He called evil, evil. And I suspect that before a decade passes, it too will implode. The cracks are already evident. Progress is being made. From Michigan to Puerto Rico, from Arizona to the District of Columbia, dedicated people are fighting for the children, for our children. And I'll tell you what, their efforts will not be in vain. Someday soon, every American boy and girl will have access to a quality education. And when that time comes, much of the credit, and I think the largest share of the credit, will belong to Bill Bennett. We've worked together, and we've played together. And I'll tell you what, I still have the knot here, right on my arm, a huge knot. I've got the bruises from those weekend football games and that Interbeltway Football League. And I'll tell you one thing that I learned about Bill Bennett. He's not only an intellectual giant, he's a giant in whatever task he wants to do. If he had had the aspiration, if that's what he wanted to do with his life, he could have been an all-pro football player. Serious. I am dead serious in this. Bill Bennett has focused public attention on the most contentious and important issues of our time. His candor, his intelligence, and his reasoned common sense approach reminds us that it is ideals and ideas that ultimately move society, and that there are eternal truths, enduring principles, and essential virtues, timeless values that society must cherish and cultivate, values that are never out of season in its young. But Bill, you have given us all a far greater gift, the clear and uncompromising model of a man of courage and conviction. Thus, I would like to have Harold Brubaker come up. I would like to have Bill Bennett come up so we can present him with the Thomas Jefferson Freedom Award. The 1994 Thomas Jefferson Freedom Award winner, Bill Bennett.
Thank you very much.
And he deserves more than that. Let's hear it for Bill Bennett. Let me read the inscription off of there. And the inscription, and I have to say that it gets a much bigger bust than this. But when we opened the box, it was in 1,000 pieces, so we're going to have to do another one. But here's what it says. With gratitude and affection, in the highest regard for your exemplary vision, intellect, leadership, and achievement in the cause of freedom, the greatest cause in America. And for those values and views which have inspired all Americans to keep the American dream alive, ALEC is proud to formally present the 1994 Thomas Jefferson Freedom Award winner to William J. Bennett, my friend Bill Bennett, whose courage of convictions, dedication to timeless values inspires us all, a man for all seasons.
Whoa. Well, I don't know if I'm going to run or not, but I know who's going to do the introductions anyway.
And I'll be there doing them too. Whenever you want me to introduce you. If you want me to introduce you, put your name in the play right, I'll do it right tonight if you want me to.
I don't know if you noticed, he said I could have been a pro football player, but when he gave me the bust, I took 2 hands to hold it. He took it back like that. Anyway, pound for pound was the only part I really objected to in your remarks. In terms of my educational critics, I would hope that when I stand up to speak to the educational bad guys, that I strike fear into their hearts for some reason other than their worry that I might sit down on them when I'm finished. But you win any way you can, I guess, provided it's within the realm of virtue. Thank you, Sam, very much for that beautiful introduction, which I would hope someday to be worthy. It felt more like it was an epitaph, and so I'm trying to get my voice back. It was most gracious and most generous, and thank you very, very much to my good friend Sam. Ladies and gentlemen, I will not be long. I take serious ideas seriously, I think. I've written a few books. I did a PhD in philosophy, but it's Saturday night. We're in Florida. It's August. You know, let's not be silly about this. You've got a party, and I'm standing between you and the party. So I will get with it. Thank you, Sam, for reminding everyone of the government jobs I was Ronald Reagan's chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. I was appointed a year after Reagan was elected. It took them a year to find a chairman of the NEH. The National Endowment for the Humanities is not the National Endowment for the Arts. The National Endowment for the Arts is the one with the dirty pictures. The National Endowment for the Humanities is the one with the dirty books, but you have to be a professor to know their dirty books. They told President Reagan he needed to appoint a professor of the humanities to run it, so they began a nationwide search for a professor of the humanities who had voted for Ronald Reagan. And there were 4 of us in the United States, and 2 of them were crazy, and I got the job. Then I became Secretary of Education, as Sam pointed out, and I got into fights with teachers' unions, the NEA, for the most part, from day one. They came to my office and said, we don't want to have public fight with you. We ought to get along. If we have a public fight, you will regret it. And I said, I'll never forget, I said, what are you going to do, put a horse in my bed? And, which is basically the way they operate, as many of you know. And we went at it, and we are still going at it, many horses later. If that wasn't enough to worry about, we had to worry about the state of American universities. I had to fly from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, California, to Stanford University to defend Western civilization as the Secretary of Education. There was an attempt to get rid of a course called Western Civilization at Stanford University on grounds that it was irrelevant. And I argued, because the student surveys had suggested that students who had taken the course thought it was a very good course, that they should keep a course in Western Civ, supplement it with a course in non-Western Civ if they wished, but keep Western Civ. The argument against the course went something like this: hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go. Which had a sort of basic appeal to it, I would say. But as an argument, I did not find compelling. The reason I went is that they couldn't find any professors on campus who would defend Western civilization, so they had to call on someone from the Reagan administration to do it. So I said a few words for our civilization, saying it was not perfect, but I thought things like individual liberty, the rule of law, freedom of conscience, freedom of worship, equality were, as civilizations went, fairly decent ideas. Well, then it was off to Drug Czar and drug busts in Liberty City, Miami, which actually does look like part of that volcano, speaker. On a bad Saturday night, it can be pretty rough. No worse than Washington, D.C., for sure. And after the drug czar job, my wife said, this is great. We started at NEH with white wine and brie and intellectuals. We went to education. Now we're doing busts in Miami. What's next, dear? Toxic and hazardous waste cleanup? I said, no, I'm going to maybe chairman of the Republican National Committee. And it's an inside joke, never mind. Anyway. Then there was the private sector, and there is life in the private sector. Indeed, there's even better life in the private sector. And I'm very pleased, Sam mentioned, and I'm very pleased so many of you tonight mentioned to me the Book of Virtues, of which I am prouder than nothing in my professional life than that book. It has sold 1.3 million copies in the United States. A month ago, it outsold Howard Stern's book 3-1. 2 weeks ago, it outsold Howard Stern and Roseanne's combined, which my friend Rush Limbaugh said is quite a thought, Howard Stern and Roseanne combined. There are no pictures in this book. The print is not that big in this book. There is nothing dirty or nasty or salacious in this book. An argument with my publisher was on the title. He said, you can't call it the Book of Virtues. That won't sell in America in the 1990s. What do I call it then? I said. The Book of Values, he said. I said, it's not the Book of Values. When I hear the word values, I reach for my Sears catalog or my Walmart catalog. This is about something else. This is about virtue. This is about excellence of character. Well, we don't think it'll sell, but we'll give it a try. Well, it's selling because the American people, confronted as they are with all sorts of things coming before them on TV and in the movies and in the street, have, I think in the case of this book, and I take great pride in it because I didn't write it, I just gathered it together, take great comfort in seeing things that are real and resilient and reliable and that are worth passing on to their children. And indeed, the most rewarding part of the story for me is the fact that the children are taking pleasure in this book. The Bennett children are. I should point out, we did not write this book out of an excess of virtue in our house. That is, that we had so much that we could share the excess with you. We are poor, sinful, struggling, erring creatures, and we too are aspiring to virtue. There's a little story in the book called The Please story. It's for little children. It's about a little word that lives in a little boy's mouth named please. He gets very sickly because he doesn't get out very often. Our 5-year-old loves the story, and on most nights he bangs the table and says, I want the please story. And we say, which story, Joseph? And he says, I want the please story. And we say, thinking by this point the moral should have caught on, I want the please story what? And he says, I want the please story now. It's an ongoing struggle, the struggle for virtue. It's not automatic. I am delighted, very pleased, and truly honored to receive the Jefferson Award. I have received a number of awards over the course of my life. I have been named Young Right-Wing Conservative, Aging Right-Wing Conservative, perhaps over the hill Right-Wing Conservative, by many counties over the course of many dinners, over the course of many years. Early on in my childhood, I got a Scouting Award, which is not easy to get in Brooklyn, New York. There are no merit badges for subways. I was an all-Catholic League tackle at Gonzaga High School in Washington and was recruited by the University of Miami, but for some reason went to Williams College. Cold climate, all male. I don't have the foggiest idea why I did that, but I did. I did get an award from my fraternity of the class of 1965, the Kappa Alpha Society. I got the award for marrying the best-looking woman. So my life has not been without merit and honor, but this is truly, truly impressive. Kemp, Thompson, Engler, Reagan. That is a pantheon of some significance, and I am very proud and honored to stand with them. And Sam, members of the board, I thank you very much. Just a few Jeffersonian thoughts. What would Jefferson say if he were alive today? Well, the obvious answer, former professor of philosophy, is that if he were alive today, he would be so old and decrepit, he would not make any sense whatsoever. But supposing we were to report to him what we were talking about at the table, supposing we were to say, Mr. Jefferson, we have been talking about limited government, we have been talking about liberty, we have been talking about enterprise, we have been talking about virtue, we have been talking about character with my 3 colleagues from Colorado, Sam and Alan and Ray. These are the things we have been talking about. Would he understand? I believe he would. He would say, yes, enterprise and freedom and virtue and character. And what the hell is Colorado? Not part of the not a put down, right? Not part of the purchase, that's all. Check Louisiana Purchase, not part of it, I don't think. But he would, I think, take great interest in what is going on here tonight and the discussion that is going on tonight. He would understand, with I think only a very brief introduction, what's at stake in the health care debate, what's at stake in the crime debate, the education debate, the welfare debate. And Sam, I want to salute you and your colleagues and your staff and everyone associated with those 45 forums for what you have done for health care. You have helped to change the mind of the American people about this issue. You have helped to educate the American people about this issue. You have helped the American people to see what is at stake in this issue. And as they have seen what is at stake, they have increasingly decided that it is not the route of big government that they wish to take. Indeed, on reflection, with perspective, we can see, if compared to other areas, why they haven't. The federal government got deeply involved in crime in the 60s, Supreme Court decisions and other actions, and now wishes to get even more deeply involved in the crime issue. Since that involvement by the federal government, crime, especially violent crime, as you know, has increased, more than 500%. There was no Department of Education before 1979, and our College Board scores and SAT scores and other things were better before the federal government got involved. The federal government started a war on poverty in the 60s and set up a system of welfare to eliminate the need for welfare. And now 5 times as many people are on welfare as were on in 1968. If we do have a federally mandated health care program, you can be sure of one thing: all of us will be sick. If we do, for health care in the federal government what we have done for crime, education, and welfare, things will get worse, not better. Thomas Jefferson is an important person in my life, and I think I agree with George Will's column of about a year ago, in which he gave himself the task of deciding who was the most consequential person of the last 1,000 years. Interesting question. It'll be asked a lot, I imagine, over the next 5 or 6. And there'll be lots of people in Washington who will probably volunteer, raise their hands, saying that they are. Will argued in his column that Jefferson is, and indeed he may well be. When I was Secretary of Education, those days which Sam fondly talked about, I went around the country teaching school, teaching classes. It was my wife's idea. She's a former elementary school teacher, special ed teacher. And when I became Secretary of Education, she said, "Why don't you go teach class?" And I said, "Elaine, I'm the Secretary of Education. I don't do retail, I do wholesale." She's the daughter of a salesman, and she said, "You do retail, and you'll probably do better wholesale. Why don't you find out what's going on?" So I went to 110 cities, 110 classrooms, and taught 4th grade classes and 7th grade classes and 11th grade classes. In the 4th grade classes, I told a story about George Washington. I talked about how George Washington had to turn his soldiers back from taking over Washington at Bayonet Point, Philadelphia, actually at that point, because they hadn't been paid. And Washington said, "We cannot start the country with a forced march on the legislature in the National Congress." A bad idea. Maybe not such a bad idea today, but yeah, still a bad idea today. But I talked about George Washington in the 4th grade in Emma Kahn Elementary School in Raleigh, North Carolina. Some of you know where that is. And I asked if there are any questions. This was during the Reagan era. A little boy raised his hand and said, "When you and other people in the cupboard meet with the president, do you all really eat Jelly Bellies?" And a little girl next to him said, "Not cupboard, cabinet, not cupboard, cabinet, cabinet." He said, "I mean the cabinet. When you all in the cabinet meet, y'all, not you all, y'all." I'm married to a Southern, we're a mixed marriage. I'm working on it. It's not you all, it's y'all. "Do y'all really eat Jelly Bellies?" And I said, you're talking about Ronald Reagan. He likes jelly beans. And do we have any? That's your question. He said, yes, sir. I said, yes. Well, Ronald Reagan has a big bowl of jelly beans. He passes them around, and I've had a few. And the little boy looked up and said, you've had more than a few, Mr. Secretary. And I told Reagan about that, and he said, let's get Gorbachev to visit that school so he can see what the air of freedom feels like. You see, you don't do that to the Minister of Education in the Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union, do you? No, you don't. Anyway, that was the 4th grade story. It was George Washington. The 11th grade story was about the Federalist Papers, James Madison. But the 7th grade story was about Jefferson. And we did the Declaration of Independence. And we talked about the most important words in the Declaration of Independence. What's the most important word? All, we, are, equal. What's the most important word? And I did it with 7th graders. And we started in Caddo Middle Magnet School in Shreveport, Louisiana. I got a group of 7th graders and got them up in front of the room and said, okay, there are 4 of us up there. And I said, who's the biggest? And they said, you are. I said, who's the oldest? They said, you are. Who's the smartest? They said, you are. I said, who's equal? And the kids at Caddo Middle Magnet School in Shreveport said, you're all equal. You're all equal, because even though they're younger and not as smart and not as old, we're all equal, because God created us equal. And that's what Mr. Jefferson wrote. I said, that's right. So I worked in Caddo Middle Magnet School in Shreveport, old classroom teacher, figured it'd work somewhere else. So I went to Osborne, Idaho. Anybody know where Osborne, Idaho is? It's about 40 miles from Coeur d'Alene, if that helps. And I went to Silver Hills Junior High School. And I walked in, the principal introduced me as the highest ranking federal official to visit Silver Hills Junior High School in Osborne, Idaho, since Theodore Roosevelt was there in 1904, he said. Parenthetical, I went back to the cabinet. I told Ronald Reagan at a cabinet meeting I was the highest ranking federal official to visit Osborne, Idaho since 1904, and Ronald Reagan, without a pause, said, oh yes, I remember that visit. That was... So I went to my class, and as with all the classes, all the classrooms, when you're in the cupboard or the cabinet, you teach a class, you got cameras in the back of the room. Dan Quayle found that out. Others of us found that out. And you make a mistake, everybody knows real fast you make a mistake. So it tends to focus the attention. Anyway, I did this lesson in Shreveport. I said it'll be no problem in Osborne. So we did the same thing. Declaration of Independence. What's the most important word? Talked about it. Let's see if we understand the concept of equality. I got Kyle and Jack and Sarah. Kyle, Jack, and Sarah. I'll never forget them. In Idaho. Got up in front of the room, and I said to the class, okay, who's the biggest? They said, you are. I said, who's the oldest? They said, you are. Who's the strongest? They said, you are. I said, who's the smartest? And the class, and as one, said, Kyle. Kyle. And I said, okay, Kyle, nice little blonde-haired Mormon kid, you know. I said, all right, Kyle, you can sit down. That's fine. Thanks very much. And he wouldn't go. He said, all right, Mr. Secretary, but before I sit down, can I ask you why we celebrate the 4th of July, or Independence Day on July 4th rather than July 3rd, which was the actual date that Adams gave Jefferson the final draft of the Declaration. And I said, you can sit down, Kyle, and we will continue. Well, there was old Kyle, and he knew his stuff, and he got the lesson right, and those kids in Osborne got the lesson right. And they understood Jefferson, and they understood what it meant that all men are created equal, and they understood how to apply that in a contemporary situation. By honoring me with the Jefferson Award, you do me an honor which it is hard for me to express words for my appreciation. You talk about my heroes, my all-time heroes, my all-time infield, outfield, backfield, front line. It's those guys. It's Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton and Jay. It's those fellows who, out of their minds, conceived the nation. Those fellows with whose ideas this nation was conceived and dedicated. Lincoln, perhaps our greatest president, always hearkened back to Jefferson and to Madison. And when he spoke of Jefferson, he spoke about he who gave us the ancient faith of our republic. And it was Lincoln who reminded us that our faith and our principles were embodied, yes, in the Constitution, but even more in the Declaration of Independence. For it was from the mind of Jefferson that we saw the culmination of centuries of thinking, the culmination of the idea, the twin ideas of liberty and equality. Liberty and equality, the two most important political ideas ever struck off by the mind of man. With virtue, the idea of virtue, I believe, the three most important ideas that define the heart, the essence of Western civilization. And what would Jefferson say tonight to our discussion? Sam, to your issues, to your legislative agenda? I think the words that he used before would be adopted with some slight changes to current circumstances. He would remind us, it seems to me, as we look at the debates about health care, about crime, and about education, about welfare, that this government, this society, is not and was not intended to be an experiment in federal tutelage. It was not intended to be an experiment in governmental preemption. Rather, it was intended to be, and still must be, an exercise in ordered liberty and in self-government, not in federal tutelage, but in self-government. Last, a closing thought and picture. Close to 2 years ago now, in the debates, in the presidential debates, the most consequential of those presidential debates occurred in Richmond, Virginia, not far from Jefferson, Madison, and the rest of that pantheon I mentioned earlier. And during the course of those debates, a stunning thing happened toward the end. A man arose in the audience, a man about 45 years old, ponytail, went to the podium, went to the microphone, and said to Mr. Bush and to Mr. Perot and Mr. Clinton, he said something much like this: "Gentlemen, you are running for President of the United States. Each of you wishes to be in charge of the country. You will be, in effect, our father. What will you do for our needs? What will you do to satisfy our needs? Tell me what you will do if you are president and father to satisfy my needs." It was, as I said, a stunning and astounding moment. And Jefferson and Madison, if they didn't flip in their graves and run headlong into Tennessee, must have had quite a shock and quite a start at hearing that question, and must have said to themselves, how could they have botched it so badly for a citizen some 205 or 10 years later to have so misthought this experiment in ordered liberty, to think that the person in charge of the federal government is the person who is there to take care of everyone's needs, to fix every leaky faucet of everyone's life. But as astounding as that was, what was perhaps even more astounding was that the question was answered by the three people on the podium. My friend George Bush demurred some, but then gave a list of things he would do. He did it that night and later on. And although he was offended by the sense of the question, as being in the heat of a campaign, he felt obligated to say what he would do to satisfy this person's needs. Mr. Perot then answered. Well, to his credit, Mr. Perot didn't answer. Mr. Perot said, get Granny out of the attic, open the hood of the car, get out of the barn. He issued a series of sagebrush aphorisms, which, if not relevant, were at least peppy. And if they didn't make any sense at all, they were at least delivered with enough effect that people found it engaging and enjoyable, though upon later investigation were found not to make any sense whatsoever, as were most of his comments. But the third speaker was the one who took the question most seriously and looked as if he might actually embrace the questioner. On and on he went, Mr. Clinton did, about how he would satisfy this man's needs. And I do not impugn Bill Clinton's good faith in this regard. I think, though I fundamentally disagree with him, he has a theory and a philosophy of government. And I think it is a theory and philosophy of government which liberal Democrats share. They may not be able to articulate it, but I think it is there instinctively, if not laid out in some serious theoretical way. And it is this: the American people are needy, and we will take care of them. And so the deal that they offer, the new practice of government they offer, is this: give us your money, and we will take care of you. Give us more of your money, and we will take care of more of you. Give us all of your money, and we will take care of everything. It is an incorrect, it is not a Jeffersonian, it is not a Madisonian, it is not an American Republican or American Democratic theory of government, but it is a theory of government, and the world has seen it before. The only response to it seems to me to be this, and that is for people who understand what Jefferson meant and who would wish it back today, to turn to the federal government and to say, not take care of our needs, but to turn to the federal government and to say, give us our money back, and give with it give us our money back, and with it we will take our own sense of responsibility. Because this federal government has arrogated too much unto itself. And whatever its intentions, good or bad, this experiment in federal government tutelage has failed. It has failed in American education, it has failed in welfare, it has failed in crime, it has failed in a host of other areas. It is now time to begin the revolution in the devolution of government, from the federal government to the states, from the states to the counties, from the counties to the towns and the cities and the townships, and from the counties and towns and townships to the neighborhoods, and finally back to the families. And in the families, for those adult family members to teach those young family members, it is finally a matter of individuals and individual responsibility. In the next As we approach the end of the second millennium, more and more of us had better be prepared to give the answer, should it be asked again at a future Richmond by someone who says, we are your dependents, we are your children, what will you do to satisfy our needs? To say, if you are truly needy and desperate, we will help. If you truly have suffered a tragedy, a disaster, an unforeseen event, we will help. But basically, democracy is a do-it-yourself proposition. Stand on your own feet. Take care of yourself, and perhaps most important, the single most important thing you do in your life is when you have a child. When you have that child, raise that child. Teach that child, nurture that child. It is with great emotion, Sam, that I accept this award, and I am deeply grateful to you and to ALEC for it. Let me just repeat again the sentiment I expressed earlier. I think we are at a very interesting time as we end the second millennium. It is time to go back to our first principles. It is time to go back to Jefferson. It is time to go back and to remind ourselves of something that couldn't be clearer if we look at the writings. This country, this America, this republic is not an experiment in federal tutelage, not an experiment in governmental preemption. It is the most sublime experiment in the history of the world in ordered liberty and in self-government. Thank you very much.
Thank you.